Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm giving this presentation, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So I'll just give you a quick introduction to the TRIPS agreement and go through the TRIPS waiver proposal and give you a little bit of history about what's happened in the 11 months or so since that proposal emerged. Talk about what's in the proposal and the case for the TRIPS waiver, debunk a few of the myths, and also talk about the bigger picture in which the TRIPS waiver sits, why it's necessary but not sufficient. So most of you, I think, will be familiar with the TRIPS agreement, which requires WTO members to provide minimum standards of intellectual property protection, and that includes patents on both products and processes of at least 20 years, and a slew of other intellectual property protections, including things like copyright, protection of trademarks, geographical indications, industrial designs, and undisclosed information such as trade secrets. And while the TRIPS agreement does have a mechanism called compulsory licensing, which is an exemption, if you like, to the requirement to acknowledge patents, and it allows exploitation of a patented product or process without the permission of the patent holder. These provisions haven't been used very often in the past, except for HIV/AIDS drugs and certain cancer drugs, and they haven't been used terribly extensively beyond those categories of drugs because they're quite time-consuming and difficult to use. And countries that have used those exemptions in the past have also faced a lot of trade pressure from trade partners like the US and the EU. So in October 2020, India and South Africa put forward a proposal at the WTO to waive a set of intellectual property rights for COVID-19 medical products during the pandemic. And this proposal, which started off just with the support of the two countries, gradually gained the support of more and more WTO members until by March this year, it had the support of over 100 of the WTO's 164 member states. At that stage, even though it had accrued quite a lot of support, the future of the waiver was still in doubt because it wasn't supported by any of the big players, the big economies, the big countries with substantial pharmaceutical industries. But there was a really game-changing development in May when the US announced that it would support a waiver limited to vaccines, but even so, for the US to support a waiver of intellectual property rights was really a very big development, because the US, of course, has been a very staunch defender of intellectual property rights on the global stage. Following that development, the proponents of the waiver, with 63 countries that had decided to formally sponsor the agreement by this stage, put forward a revised decision text on the 21st of May. And this decision text was basically very similar to the original proposal, but clarified the scope and the duration of the waiver. And I'll talk a little bit more about this revised decision text in a few moments. The EU was strongly opposed to the waiver and remained opposed, even though it was getting so much support from other countries. And in June, put forward a counter proposal to the TRIPS waiver, which basically said that the compulsory licensing provisions in the TRIPS agreement would be sufficient to meet the needs of low and middle income countries during the pandemic, and that these provisions just needed a little bit of tweaking to make them work better in a situation like a pandemic. And the EU has stuck to this position to the present time and hasn't really moved at all from that position. Later in June, all of the WTO member states agreed to move forward to text-based discussions, which was another positive development, because at that until that point, they'd only been talking about it as a general idea. So things did move along, but we still have these two camps. You know, a lot of the developing countries on one side supporting the TRIPS waiver, and the EU, particularly Germany, which is a strong opponent, the UK and Switzerland remaining opposed. Really significantly, Australia declared its support in early September this year, but hasn't moved to co-sponsor the proposal. So that's where a lot of the advocacy work is focusing in Australia at the moment, on trying to get Australia to move past that sort of declaration of general support to actually putting itself firmly in the co-sponsors camp. So the next month or so is really important in terms of the timing of this. We've got a TRIPS Council meeting coming up on the 16th of November, and then the WTO Ministerial Council meeting from the 30th of November to the 3rd of December. So it's really crunch time for the proposal, because if there isn't a consensus emerging by the 30th of November, it's hard to see what the future is going to hold for this really important proposal. So for those who aren't familiar with the details, the revised proposal would apply to health products and technologies to prevent, treat and contain COVID-19, which includes not just vaccines, which a lot of people are focused on, but also therapeutics, so treatments, along with diagnostics, devices like ventilators, for example, and personal protective equipment, like things like masks. But not only the health products and technologies themselves, but also their materials and components and the methods and means of manufacture. And I'll come back to this a little bit later, because the fact that the TRIPS waiver applies to all of the things that go into the manufacturing of these products and the methods and means of manufacture, this is why the compulsory licensing provisions in the TRIPS agreement won't be enough to solve this problem of making these products available in low and middle income countries. And another really important feature of the TRIPS waiver is that it applies not just to patents, but also to other intellectual property rights like copyright, industrial designs, which are really important for things like ventilators or masks, patents, and also protection of undisclosed information, like the detailed information about the manufacturing processes for vaccines and other really complex biological products, which are often protected as trade secrets. And the proponents are arguing that the TRIPS waiver should last for at least 3 years from the date of the decision at the WTO, and then be annually reviewed depending on how the pandemic unfolds from that point onwards. So I'll now just go through the case for the waiver in terms of inequities in access to COVID-19 medical products, the vaccine nationalism that we've seen, where wealthy countries have monopolised the products that have been produced so far, the failure of COVAX, the mechanism for equitably distributing COVID-19 vaccines, and some of the intellectual property barriers that we've seen so far in terms of these products. So I think a lot of people are aware already of the really stark inequities in access to COVID-19 medical products that we've seen. And these were sort of set in place quite early in the pandemic. By November 2020, countries that accounted for only 14% of the global population had pre-purchased more than half of the first 7.5 billion doses. And the inequities have only grown worse since then. So by August this year, 80% of doses that had been administered were in high or upper middle income countries, whereas low and middle income countries only had administered 1.5 doses per 100 people, whereas high income countries by that stage had around a 50% vaccination rate, or 1 dose per person. And now we're seeing high income countries continuing to stockpile vaccines for booster shots. And even after the boosters, they're predicted to have more than 1 billion doses left over by the end of 2021. And we're in the bizarre situation where we're seeing vaccine doses expiring in high-income countries where not even health workers have been vaccinated in many low-income countries. But it's not only vaccines that are the problem. So we're now seeing some experimental treatments being developed for COVID-19, which are likely to become really important as they, finish the trials and start getting regulatory approval, particularly for people who are not vaccinated or can't be vaccinated for some reason. And some of these treatments are things like the treatment produced by Regeneron, which was made famous by Donald Trump, who took their antibody cocktail, which costs around $2,100 in the US for a course of treatment. While it's a cheaper version can be made in India, there are patent applications in 11 low and middle income countries. So this is going to be a problem. And I'll talk a bit more later on about a couple of other treatments that are starting to show promise as well. And diagnostics are also another issue. So while there are an average of 603 diagnostic tests per 100,000 people in high-income countries, the rate in low-income countries is about 5 per 100,000. And of course, these are really important in managing and controlling the pandemic. So some of you will be familiar with this type of graph. This dates back to November last year, showing the number of courses of vaccines that some of the high-income countries had purchased by that date. So Canada, by that stage, had pre-purchased enough vaccines to vaccinate its population 5 times over, Australia close to 3, and I'll show you in a moment where Australia has actually surged quite far ahead there. And you can see many of the other high-income countries not very far behind. So Australia now has actually ordered 280.8 million doses for our population of 25.9 million people, which is 10.8 doses per person, or because they're all 2-dose vaccines, enough to vaccinate our population more than 5 times over. And we've made an investment of $8 billion in those vaccines. On the other side of the equation, although we've been relatively generous in the donations that we've made to other countries by global standards, we've made commitments to share around 60 million doses with the Asia Pacific region, and we've made a number of monetary commitments as well, bilateral commitments, and 130 million to COVAX. So far, we've only managed to actually deliver less than 6 million of those doses. So we've made a lot of pledges for the future, but the need is really now. And if we wait too long to make those donations, that we're not meeting the need, and we risk variants emerging in areas where the virus is not well under control. So this is just another graphic to show you the very yawning gap between the vaccine coverage in high income versus low income countries, although this is now out of date and the disparity is much larger at this point. So another really important part of the picture is the failure of COVAX, the mechanism for equitably distributing COVID-19 vaccines, which initially aimed to deliver 2 billion doses by the end of 2021, which was actually a very modest aim. Although 2 billion sounds like a lot, it's only enough to vaccinate 20% of the population in the 92 low-income countries that are dependent on COVAX. And even that modest forecast was wound back to 1.25 billion in September because COVAX was having so much trouble because the wealthy countries had bought up so much of the supply by that point. And by today, only 470.5 million doses have been delivered by COVAX, which is way behind schedule. So just to give you an example of why intellectual property is a problem in terms of access to these products. So if we look at the example of remdesivir, which was a promising treatment early on in the pandemic, it's turned out to be not as good as it was expected to be. Gilead Sciences, which produced the drug, owned patents in more than 70 countries, and it set the price for a 5-day course of treatment at $2,430. And this is for a drug where the cost of production has been estimated by independent scientific experts at less than $1 per day. To make this more outrageous, the development of this drug was underpinned by at least $70 million in public funding. And although Gilead Sciences negotiated with companies in India, Pakistan, and Egypt to have them create cheaper copies of the drug, these licenses limited the exports to 127 mainly low-income countries. So the countries that were missing out were countries like China, Mexico, Brazil, the more sort of middle-income countries with larger populations, but where it was still very difficult for those countries to buy the expensive version produced by Gilead, but they couldn't access the cheaper version that was being made in India, Pakistan, and Egypt. And then to add insult to injury, the US government, of course, bought up almost all of the first 3 months' supply, excluding everyone else from the market anyway. So although remdesivir didn't turn out to be a very big deal, we now have 2 much more promising treatments. One of them is called molnupiravir, produced by Merck, which appears to reduce the risk of hospitalisation by around 50% for those with mild or moderate COVID-19. And there's also a new drug produced by Pfizer, which appears to reduce the risk of hospitalisation and death by around 89%. So these are very promising treatments, not yet approved. Still regulatory agencies still need to look very closely at the data and think about how these drugs would be used. There needs to be more safety studies. But we're seeing the same sorts of behaviour by these companies. So Merck, which produces molnupiravir, has priced it at around $700 US for a course of treatment. And although it's licensed some generic companies to supply 109 low-income countries, it's also excluding the middle-income countries from that deal in the same way that Gilead Sciences did. And Pfizer has not promised to license its drug to other agencies, but has said that it will use tiered pricing. So it will price its drug differently in different countries and use contract manufacturing to try and increase the supply. But this is a very limited approach to trying to make the drug available. So we're likely to see access problems to these therapeutics becoming a much bigger issue in the future. This diagram comes from a paper in Nature Biotechnology about the complex kind of network of patents that surround a lot of these vaccines and biologic drugs, where compulsory licensing, while it might be useful for freeing up the patents for very simple drugs, it's very difficult to use compulsory licensing for things like vaccines and biologics because of the kind of thicket of patents that sit behind those. So it's not just the product itself that's patented, it's also a whole lot of patents on the processes and the platform technologies and the different products that make up those complex products. And the pharmaceutical industry has not taken enough steps to try and increase the global supply in its own right. So it hasn't done very much in terms of negotiating voluntary licenses with other companies, or and virtually nothing in terms of making its intellectual property and technologies more widely available. So this table comes from a briefing by Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, looking at the the vaccine front runners, the mRNA vaccine producers, and the manufacturers that they've made deals with. And you can see that apart from China, there's no, not even any middle-income countries that they've announced deals with, let alone low-income countries. Oops, sorry. Just go back to the previous slide. There we go. So I'll just go through now some of the myths around this TRIPS waiver, because of course the pharmaceutical industry is lobbying hard against it, and the countries like Germany and Switzerland and the UK are arguing that it's unnecessary. It won't actually solve the problem. So I'll go through some of those arguments and explain why that's not actually the case. So one of the main arguments against it is that intellectual property is actually important for stimulating innovation. And if we waive intellectual property rights, we won't see these new products being developed either for COVID-19 or for future pandemics. But of course, the normal market dynamics don't apply when it comes to pandemics. And the development of COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics has been underpinned by absolutely massive injections of public funding. And MSF reported in November last year that the 6 front-running vaccine candidates have had a total of over $12 billion of taxpayer and public money poured into them. So it's not private investment that's underpinning these products, it's public funding. So there's a strong argument that these publicly funded products should be made much more publicly available instead of the private companies being able to recoup huge profits from them. The development of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was 97% publicly funded, according to researchers. But the projected revenue of a lot of these companies is very high. As Pat mentioned earlier, Pfizer just recently updated its projection to 36 billion for 2021, and Moderna's not too far behind that at 18.4 billion. So another common myth that we hear is that there isn't enough manufacturing capacity in low and middle income countries, so that even if the TRIPS waiver did come into effect, low and middle income countries wouldn't be able to take advantage of it. But this is simply not true. There are established vaccine manufacturers in Africa, Latin America and Asia, and even before COVID-19, a large proportion of the vaccines that were manufactured worldwide were in these parts of the world. And MSF has found that there are at least 7 accredited sterile injectable manufacturers which could make vaccines in Africa with capacity to make mRNA vaccines within months. And there've also been centres selected in South American countries as mRNA hubs by the Pan American Health Organization. So the capacity definitely is there. Another myth that we often hear is that the problem isn't intellectual property, it's actually problems with the supply chain. So it's a shortage of the plastic bioreactor bags that are needed to make the vaccines in, or other, inputs to the manufacturing process. And there certainly are shortages of raw materials. This is part of the problem. But actually the intellectual property rights contribute to those shortages because they exclude competitors from the market, and this makes it much more difficult to scale up the supply. So if we look at those plastic bioreactor bags, there's actually only a very small number of companies, 4 main players in the market, and they're very heavily protected by patents. So if we waive the intellectual property rights, not just on the finished products, but on the components and the raw materials that go into them, we might be able to solve some of these issues much more quickly. And finally, the myth that the EU particularly likes to propagate is that compulsory licensing will be enough. But compulsory licensing only applies to patents. It doesn't apply to things like the industrial designs for the ventilators or the trade secrets protection that covers a lot of the information about the vaccine manufacturing process. And it doesn't apply to, all of those inputs to the processes unless there's compulsory licensing applications made for all of those steps along the way, as well as the finished product. So it's not really practical to use compulsory licensing for these really complex products, because it would need to be done on a case-by-case, product-by-product basis. They're time-consuming and onerous to use. Countries that use them face trade pressure. And although Bolivia decided it wanted to use a compulsory license to import COVID-19 vaccines from a Canadian company, the Canadian government actually refused to issue a license to enable the Canadian company BioLies to actually manufacture those vaccines. So we haven't seen compulsory licensing being used successfully to solve this supply issue. So finally, just to wind up, the TRIPS waiver is vitally important in terms of ramping up the global supply and addressing the inequities that we're seeing in access to COVID-19 health products and technologies, because it would enable companies to freely produce these products and technologies without fear of litigation over IP infringement, which is currently an issue. And it would also create a lot of leverage to encourage cooperation of the pharmaceutical industry towards other solutions. The pharmaceutical industry is saying, we don't need to waive intellectual property rights, we can do other things, but they're not committing to those other things. They're not actually making it happen. If there's a waiver of intellectual property rights, it really forces their hand to cooperate much more effectively and actually enter into voluntary licensing arrangements. The TRIPS waiver on its own isn't enough to solve the problems that we're seeing of lack of global supply and inequitable access. We also need much more in terms of donations of both funds and products, and we need countries not just to pledge those for the future, but to actually bring forward their donations to the present and to make those donations through COVAX so that they're equitably distributed and not just given in line with countries' national interests and not going to where they're most needed. Countries also need to put pressure on pharmaceutical companies to share their intellectual property, technology, and know-how. And the most effective way to do that is to write it into the contracts when countries are actually giving money for research and development, to make sure that the companies are actually then sharing their information more widely. And of course, we also need to invest in manufacturing capacity in low and middle income countries and support them to start manufacturing these products. The TRIPS waiver is a really important part of the picture, and I'm very pleased that AFTINET is campaigning on this issue, and alongside many other health, humanitarian and aid organisations to and have had such success in getting Australia to support this initiative, and also many other countries. And I hope that we can get consensus on this issue before the Ministerial Council meeting on the 30th of November. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak, and I'll hand it back to Tim for questions.
Thank you, Deb. Thanks. That was fantastic. I'm sure there's a lot of questions for you. So in a moment, we'll move